The Hall of 10,000 Voices was the largest structure ever built by intelligent life. It floated in the empty space between three dying stars, and its walls were made of crystal that had been grown over millions of years. Every species that had ever joined the Concord had a seat in this hall. 4,000 civilizations, 4,000 flags, 4,000 voices that spoke as one. Today, all of them were silent. Ambassador Elena Vasquez stood alone in the center of the great floor. She was a small woman with gray hair and tired eyes. She had served humanity for 40 years in this place. She had made friends among the stars. She had learned to speak 12 alien languages. She had believed, truly believed, that the Concord was a force for good in the galaxy. Now she stood accused of crimes against galactic law. The Arbiter General floated above her. It was a creature made of living crystal, older than Earth's sun. Its voice rang through the hall like the sound of breaking glass. The species known as humanity is charged with violation of Sovereign Development Protocol, the Arbiter said. 300 years ago, you joined our Concord. You agreed to follow our laws. You broke your promise. Elena said nothing. There was nothing to say. The charges were true. 30 years ago, a gamma-ray burst had struck a small world on the edge of explored space. The planet was called Kethra, and it was home to a young species just learning to build cities and grow crops. The radiation killed half of them in a single day. The survivors faced slow death from poison and starvation. The Concord had debated what to do. The debate lasted 3 days. In the end, they voted. The Kethri were a primitive species, not yet ready for contact with the galaxy. The law was clear. No interference with developing species. The natural order must be preserved. The Kethri were meant to die. Humanity had watched the vote. They had listened to ancient species explain why it was better to let children starve than to break a rule. They had heard the Vethkai delegate call the Kethri an unfortunate loss and suggest the Concord study their extinction for scientific purposes. And humanity had said no. 2,000 human volunteers had traveled to Kethra in secret. They had brought medicine and food. They had taught the survivors how to clean their water and grow new crops. They had built schools and hospitals. They had worked for 30 years, asking nothing in return. The Kethri had survived. They had grown. They had built a new civilization from the ashes of the old. And they had learned that they were not alone in the universe. That somewhere among the stars, there were beings who cared whether they lived or died. Now the Concord knew. The Arbiter General's crystal body pulsed with cold light. Humanity has confessed to this crime. The evidence is clear. The law is clear. This body must now deliver its verdict. Elena looked up at the thousands of faces watching her. Some were made of flesh. Some were made of light. Some were clouds of gas or swarms of tiny machines. All of them were old. All of them had followed the Concord's laws for longer than humanity had existed. None of them would meet her eyes. The verdict is guilty, the Arbiter announced. Humanity will pay reparations equal to 60% of their economic output for 200 years. All human personnel will be removed from Kethra immediately. The Kethri species will be returned to natural development status. Elena felt cold. She knew what those words meant. Return to natural development status. It meant the Concord would take away everything humanity had given them. Their medicine, their technology, their hope. It meant the Kethri would watch their children die of diseases they had learned to cure. It meant genocide with clean hands. The Concord will monitor the transition, the Arbiter continued. Any further human interference will result in military action against Earth and all human colonies. This verdict is final. This verdict is just. This verdict is law. The hall waited for Elena to bow her head, to accept the judgment, to return to her people and tell them they had lost. Elena thought about the Kethri girl she had met last year. Her name was Sally, and she was 12 years old. She wanted to be a doctor when she grew up. She wanted to heal people the way the humans had healed her grandmother, Elena, thought about the Kethri, poet who had written verses about the strange beings from the stars who had taught his people to hope again. She thought about the scientists and teachers and farmers who had built a future from nothing. She thought about what it meant to be human. Her voice was steady when she spoke. It carried across the great hall, reaching every ear and every translator. We refuse. The silence that followed was absolute. For a long moment, nothing moved. Then the Arbiter General's crystal body flashed with angry light. You refuse? The ancient being seemed unable to understand the words. No species has defied an Arbiter's verdict in 9,000 years. You cannot refuse. We can, Elena said. We do. Humanity will not participate in genocide. We will not abandon those who trusted us. We will not stand by while children die because your laws find their survival inconvenient. Voices erupted across the hall. Delegates shouted in 100 languages. The Vethkai representative demanded immediate military action. Others called for calm, for negotiation, for reason. Elena ignored them all. She turned and began to walk toward the great doors. Her footsteps echoed in the chaos. The Arbiter's voice cut through the noise like a blade. If you leave this hall, Ambassador, you leave the Concord. Humanity will stand alone. You will face sanctions, isolation, and if necessary, war. Your species is young. You cannot survive without us. Elena stopped at the doors. She did not turn around. We survived ice ages, she said. We survived plagues. We survived ourselves. We will survive this. She pushed open the doors. And when we do, she added, the Kethri will survive with us. She walked out into the cold light of dying stars. Behind her, the hall of 10,000 voices descended into chaos. Humanity's 300 years in the Concord had ended. Something new was about to begin. The news reached Earth in 17 minutes. By the 18th minute, the planet was in chaos. Premier James Okonkwo stood at the window of his office in Geneva and watched the crowds gather below. Some carried signs demanding war with the Concord. Others begged for peace at any cost. Police drones floated between the groups, their lights flashing warnings that nobody seemed to hear. His secretary appeared at the door. Sir, the Parliament is assembled. They're waiting for you. Okonkwo nodded. He was 63 years old. He had been premier for 8 years. He had dealt with economic crises and natural disasters and political scandals. Nothing had prepared him for this. He walked into the Parliament chamber and faced 600 representatives from every human world. They fell silent when they saw him. 600 faces. 600 questions. 600 fears. You have all seen the verdict, Okonkwo said. You know what the Concord demands. 60% of our economy for 200 years. Complete withdrawal from Kethra, and the end of the Kethri civilization. A representative from Mars stood up. We have no choice, Premier. The Concord has 4,000 species. They have fleets that could destroy Earth in hours. We have to accept the verdict. We have to survive. Another voice called out. Our children's future depends on it. Okonkwo raised his hand for silence. He pressed a button on his podium, and the chamber's walls lit up with images. A Kethri classroom. Children with forearms and glowing eyes sat at desks made of local wood. A human teacher stood at the front, showing them how to read. A Kethri hospital. Doctors used equipment that humans had built to save a mother and her newborn child. A Kethri farm. Crops grew tall and green in soil that humans had taught them to heal. 30 years ago, Okonkwo said, 2,000 of our people looked at these children and decided that they deserved to live. They gave up their careers. They left their families. They worked in secret, knowing that if they were caught, they would be punished. They did it anyway. He changed the image. A video began to play. A Kethri poet stood on a stage, reciting words that had been translated into English. His voice was strange and musical, but the meaning was clear. They came from the darkness between stars. They asked for nothing. They gave us everything. When the fire fell from the sky and our world burned, they taught us how to live again. We do not know why they saved us. We only know that they did. And we will never forget. The chamber was silent. The Concord wants us to erase this, Okonkwo said. They want us to take back our medicine and watch these people die. They want us to tell this poet that his words were a mistake. They want us to explain to those children that the Concord's laws are more important than their lives. He looked out at the representatives. I cannot do that. I will not do that. And I do not believe that humanity can do that and still call itself human. A representative from the asteroid colonies stood up. What about our children, Premier? What about our future? The Concord controls trade routes that our colonies depend on. Without them, millions of our people will starve. Then we will find new trade routes, Okonkwo said. We will build new economies. We have done it before. When our ancestors left Africa, they had nothing. When they crossed the oceans, they had nothing. When they reached the stars, they had nothing. And every time, they built something new. This is different, the representative insisted. We are not fighting nature. We are fighting the entire galaxy. No, a new voice said. We are not. Everyone turned. Ambassador Elena Vasquez walked into the chamber. She had traveled for 3 days without sleep to reach Earth. Her face was pale and her eyes were red, but her voice was strong. The Concord is not the galaxy, she said. It is a group of old species who are afraid of change. They have built laws to protect the way things are. They do not understand why anyone would risk everything for strangers. She walked to the center of the chamber. But they are not the only ones out there. I have spoken with the remnant clans who left the Concord 1,000 years ago. I have spoken with the drifter collectives who never joined at all. I have even received a message from the archivists who have watched the galaxy for 1,000,000 years and never spoken to anyone. She smiled for the first time in days. They are watching us. They want to see what we will do. And some of them are ready to help. Okonkwo felt hope spark in his chest. What do they want in return? Nothing, Elena said. They are curious. They have never seen a species choose principle over survival. They want to know if we are real. They want to know if we mean what we say. The chamber buzzed with whispers. Representatives argued in small groups. Fear fought with hope. Then a door opened at the back of the room. A Kethri delegation entered. They had traveled in secret, risking their lives to reach Earth. Their leader was an old female with silver patterns on her skin. Her name was Thesa, and she was the closest thing the Kethri had to a president. She walked to the center of the chamber and stood beside Elena. Her glowing eyes swept across the human. Representatives, my people have asked me to deliver a message, she said. Her English was accented, but clear. We know what you are facing. We know the cost of protecting us. We did not ask you to save us 30 years ago. We do not ask you to save us now. She paused. But we want you to know that whatever you decide, we are grateful. You taught us that we are not alone. You taught us that the universe can be kind. No matter what happens next, we will carry that knowledge with us. To the end. Silence filled the chamber. Okonkwo looked at Elena. Elena looked at Thesa. Thesa looked at the human representatives, who held her people's future in their hands. Finally, Okonkwo spoke. Call the vote. The vote took 7 minutes. When it was over, the result flashed on every screen in the chamber, in favor of accepting the Concords. Verdict, 89. Against, 511. Humanity had made its choice. Elena stepped forward and placed her hand on Thesa's shoulder. The Kethri leader looked up at her with eyes full of tears. "You are not alone," Elena said. "You never will be." Outside the chamber, the crowd saw the result on their screens. The shouting stopped. For a long moment, the entire planet seemed to hold its breath. Then, slowly, a new chant began to rise. Never alone. Never alone. Never alone. It spread from Geneva to Tokyo, to New York, to the Mars colonies, to the stations, orbiting distant stars. Humanity had spoken. Now they had to face what came next. A Concord gave humanity 30 days to change their minds. The message was delivered by a Lyracy diplomat named Vithana, an ancient creature with too many eyes and a voice like wind through dead trees. She met with Premier Okonkwo in his office on Earth and spoke for 3 hours. She explained the consequences. Trade sanctions that would cripple human colonies. Travel bans that would strand millions far from home. And if humanity still refused, military action. "We do not wish to destroy you," Vithana said. "You have been useful to the Concord. Your soldiers fought well against the Veth swarm. Your scientists have made interesting discoveries. But the law is the law. If you defy the Arbiter's verdict, you defy the Concord itself. We cannot allow that." Okonkwo listened patiently. When she finished, he asked a single question. "Have you ever loved someone?" Vethno's many eyes blinked in confusion. "I do not understand the question." "Love," Okonkwo said. "Have you ever cared about another being so much that you would sacrifice yourself to protect them? Have you ever felt that connection? That bond?" The diplomat was silent for a long moment. "My species does not experience such emotions. We reproduce through budding. We do not form ... attachments." "Then you cannot understand why we are doing this," Okonkwo said. "And we cannot explain it to you. But the answer is no. Humanity will not change its mind." Vethna left without another word. The 30 days passed quickly. Across human space, preparations began. Families said goodbye to friends who lived in Concord territories. Ships loaded with colonists began the long journey back to human worlds. Businesses closed. Markets crashed. Fear spread like a disease, but something else spread too. Something the Concord had not expected. Pry. On the mining stations of the asteroid belt, workers painted messages on their equipment. "We stand with the Kethri." On Mars, students organized marches through the domed cities. On Earth, artists created murals and songs and stories about the choice humanity had made. On the last day, Ambassador Elena Vasquez delivered her final address to the Concord. She stood in a small room on a human station at the edge of known space. Her words were broadcast to every world that could receive them. 300 years ago, she said, humanity made first contact with alien life. We were young and afraid and alone. The Concord offered us protection. They offered us trade. They offered us a place among the stars. We accepted with gratitude. She paused. On 10,000 worlds, beings of every shape and size watched her face on their screens. We learned much from the Concord. We learned about science and technology and the history of the galaxy. But we also learned something else. We learned that the Concord's laws were not made for justice. They were made for order. They were made to preserve the way things are, no matter the cost. Her voice grew stronger. The Concord decided that the Kethri should die, not because they were dangerous, not because they had committed crimes, but because saving them would break the rules, because helping them would be inconvenient. She shook her head. Humanity cannot accept this. We cannot stand in a hall with 4,000 species and vote on whether children deserve to live. We cannot call that civilization. We cannot call that law. We cannot call that justice. Alina straightened her back and looked directly into the camera. Today, every human representative across Concord space will stand up from their seats. They will turn around, and they will walk away. We are leaving the Concord, not in anger, but in sorrow. Not because we hate you, but because we cannot be like you. She took a breath. We are taking the Kethri with us. They will live in human space, under human protection. And we will build something new together. Something better. Something that remembers what the Concord has forgotten. Tears appeared in her eyes, but she did not look away. To the species who showed us kindness over the centuries, we say thank you. To those who warned us that this day would come, we say you were right. To those who secretly agreed with us, but were afraid to speak, we say the door is always open. She smiled. It was a sad smile, but there was strength in it. And to the Concord itself, we say this: when you remember what justice truly means, when you understand why some things are worth fighting for, when you are ready to build laws that protect the weak instead of the powerful, we will be waiting. Until then, humanity walks alone. The broadcast ended at that exact moment. Across hundreds of star systems, human representatives stood up in the Hall of 10,000 Voices. The human delegation rose from their seats and walked toward the great doors. In trade stations and diplomatic offices and military commands, humans gathered their belongings and left. The Concord watched in stunned silence. They had expected negotiations. They had expected fear. They had expected humanity to bend like every other species had bent for 9,000 years. They had not expected this. The first human fleets began their withdrawal before the day was over. They moved in perfect coordination, ship after ship after ship, jumping toward human space. They left behind homes and businesses and friends. They gave up wealth and comfort and safety. They did not look back. On Kethra, the human volunteers who had worked for 30 years received the news. They began packing their equipment, but they were not leaving alone. Every Kethri who wanted to come with them was welcome. Ships arrived to carry them to their new home. An old Kethri farmer stood at the door of the house the humans had helped him build. He watched the ships descend from the sky and turned to the human doctor who had saved his wife's life 10 years ago. Why? He asked. Why do you risk so much for us? The doctor thought about the question. She was tired and scared and uncertain about the future. But she knew the answer. Because you matter, she said. Because every life matters. And because, if we forget that, we forget what makes us human. The farmer nodded slowly. He did not fully understand, but he accepted it. Then we will remember, he said. We will teach our children, and they will teach theirs. For as long as the Kethri exist, we will remember what humanity did for us. He took her hand in his four-fingered grip. We will never forget. By midnight, the withdrawal was complete. 40 billion humans and 3 billion Kethri had begun their journey to new lives. The stations and outposts they left behind fell dark. The trade routes they had maintained grew silent. The Concord watched from their ancient halls and tried to understand what had happened. They could not in all their 9,000 years. They had never seen a species choose principle over survival. They had never imagined that anyone would walk away from everything they had built because it was the right thing to do. But humanity had done exactly that. And now, for the first time in millennia, the galaxy was changing. The first year was the hardest. Without Concord trade routes, human colonies ran short of essential supplies. Medicine became rare. Food production fell. On the frontier worlds, people learned to survive on less than they ever thought possible. Premier Okonkwo, aged 10 years and 12 months. He worked 18 hours a day, coordinating relief efforts and negotiating new trade agreements with anyone who would talk to humanity. He slept on a couch in his office because he did not have time to go home. But humanity did not break. On Mars, engineers developed new methods to grow food in sealed domes. On the asteroid colonies, miners shared their resources with struggling settlements. On Earth, families opened their homes to refugees from the frontier dot, and slowly, new friends appeared. The remnant clans were the first to arrive. They were a collection of species who had left the Concord long ago for reasons they did not fully explain. Their ships were old and strange, and their customs were unlike anything humanity had encountered. But they brought supplies and knowledge, and something even more valuable. They brought respect. "We watched your walk," their leader told Ambassador Vasquez. He was a creature made of living metal, and his voice sounded like grinding gears. "We did not believe you would actually do it. We thought you would negotiate. We thought you would bend. When you kept walking, we knew you were different." Elena accepted his gifts with gratitude. "Why did you leave the Concord?" "The same reason as you," the metal being said. "They asked us to do something we could not do. They called it law. We called it murder. We walked away, and we have never regretted it." He looked at the human ships gathered in orbit around Earth. "You will face difficult years ahead. The Concord will try to make an example of you. They will hope that your suffering will discourage others from following your path. But if you survive, you will be stronger than ever." "And if we don't survive?" Elena asked, the metal being made a sound that might have been laughter. "Then you will have proved that some things are worth dying for. That is also a kind of victory." The drifter collectives came next. They were not a single species, but a fleet of ships that had traveled the galaxy for millions of years, collecting members from 1,000 different worlds. They had no home and no government. They simply moved from place to place, trading and exploring and remembering. They taught humanity how to survive in isolation. They shared maps of secret routes that the Concord did not control. They introduced humanity to other civilizations that existed outside the Concord's reach, and they brought news from inside the Concord itself. "There is unrest," a drifter captain told Premier Okonkwo. She was a small creature covered in feathers, and her eyes were the color of stars. "Many species are asking questions. Why did the humans leave? Why would they give up so much? Some are saying that perhaps the Concord's laws are not as just as they claimed." Okonkwo felt hope for the first time in months. "Will they leave too?" "Not yet," the captain said. "Fear holds them in place. But seeds have been planted. Your walk changed something in the galaxy. People are thinking thoughts they have not thought in a very long time." The Kethri settled on a world that humanity had prepared for them. It was a beautiful planet with blue seas and green forests, and they named it New Kethra. Within a year, they had built cities. Within 5 years, they had universities. Within 10, they had ships of their own. They did not forget what humanity had done for them. Kethri. Scientists worked alongside human researchers. Kethri engineers improved human designs with their unique mathematical abilities. Kethri artists created works that combined both. Cultures in ways no one had imagined. Dot and Kethri soldiers volunteered for human fleets. "You protected us when we were weak," a young Kethri officer told his human captain. "Now we are strong enough to protect you." 20 years passed. Humanity's economy recovered, and then grew beyond what it had been before. The isolation that the Concord had meant as punishment became a source of strength. Without the restrictions of Concord law, human scientists experimented freely. They developed new technologies that the ancient species had never imagined. 50 years passed. Human and Kethri ships patrolled the borders of their space together. They were faster and more advanced than anything in the Concord fleet. The fear that the Concord had tried to create had become something else entirely. It had become respect. 100 years passed. Premier Okonkwo was long dead, but his statue stood in the center of Geneva. Beside him stood a statue of Thesa, the Kethri leader who had traveled to Earth on that fateful day. Their hands were joined in a symbol of friendship that would never be broken. And then the news came. The Veth swarm had returned. It was larger than before, smarter than before, and it was heading directly for Concord space. The ancient species who had laughed at humanity's departure suddenly found themselves facing extinction. A Liresi ship appeared at the edge of human space. It carried a single passenger, an old diplomat named Vithana, the same being who had delivered the Concord's ultimatum a century ago. She was brought to meet the new premier, a woman named Yuki Tanaka, whose grandmother had been one of the original volunteers on Kethra. Vithana's many eyes were dim with age and fear. Her voice shook when she spoke. "The swarm is coming," she said. 17 of our systems have already fallen. The Vethkai are gone. The Archon Collective is gone. Species that existed before your world had life are now nothing but dust. She lowered her great head. We came to beg for help. We know we do not deserve it. We know what we did to you. But if you do not help us, the Concord will fall. 4,000 species will die. Premier Tanaka looked at the creature who had once threatened her people with destruction. She thought about her grandmother's stories of the early days on Kethra. She thought about the children who had learned to read in schools built by human hands. She thought about what it meant to be human. "Why should we help you?" she asked. "You tried to destroy us. You wanted to kill an entire species because they were inconvenient. You called us young and foolish." Vethana's eyes leaked fluid that might have been tears. "You are not foolish," she whispered. "We were. We were so afraid of change that we forgot why the Concord was created in the first place. We forgot that laws exist to serve life, not the other way around." She lifted her head and met Tanaka's gaze. "We were wrong. And if we survive this, we will try to remember what you taught us. We will try to be better." Tanaka was silent for a long moment, then she smiled. "Humanity does not abandon those in need," she said. "That is why we left the Concord. That is why we saved the Kethri. That is why we cannot turn our backs on you now, even after everything you did to us." She stood and offered her hand to the ancient diplomat. "We will help you. Not as subjects returning to a master. Not as children asking for forgiveness. We will come as equals. And the Kethri will stand with us." Vethana took her hand. Her grip was weak, but there was hope in her eyes. "Thank you," she said. "Thank you." Tanaka turned to her advisors. "Send word to the fleet. We're going to war." The human Kethri fleet jumped into Concord space 3 days after Premier Tanaka gave the order. 3,000 ships emerged from faster-than-light travel in perfect formation. At their head was the flagship Elena Vasquez, named for the ambassador who had walked out of the Hall of 10,000. Voices a century ago, Admiral Chun Wei stood on the bridge and watched the sensors light up with enemy contacts. The Veth swarm was everywhere. Millions of ships, each one carrying creatures that existed only to consume and destroy. They had already eaten 17 star systems. They would eat more if they were not stopped. "All ships, this is Admiral Chun," he said into the fleet-wide channel. "We did not ask for this fight. We did not want this fight. But the people of the Concord need our help, and we will not turn them away. Today, we show the galaxy what humanity is made of. Today, we fight." The fleet moved forward. The first battle lasted 6 hours. The swarm threw itself at the human lines with mindless fury. They were fast and numerous and completely without fear. But human weapons were better than anything the swarm had faced before. Energy beams sliced through their hulls. Missiles exploded among their formations. And when the swarm ships got too close, human pilots met them with the same stubbornness that had carried humanity through every crisis in their history. By the end of the day, 1,000,000 swarm ships were destroyed. Humanity had lost 200 vessels. But they had held. The Concord watched in amazement. The Lyracy admiral, who had been commanding the defense of the sector, sent a message to Admiral Chun. "We have been fighting the swarm for 2 years. We have never seen anyone stand against them like this. How do you do it?" Chun smiled. "We fight for something worth fighting for. That makes all the difference." The war continued for 7 years. Humanity and the Kethri pushed the swarm back one system at a time. They liberated worlds that had been under siege for months. They rescued populations that had given up hope. And everywhere they went, they showed the galaxy that the species the Concord had once called young and foolish was neither. The swarm adapted. It created new weapons and new strategies. It attacked human colonies far from the front lines. It tried to wear humanity down through attrition. But humanity adapted, too. Scientists developed new shields that could resist swarm attacks. Engineers built ships that were faster and stronger than anything before. And the Kethri, who had once been primitive farmers, contributed mathematical insights that no human could have imagined. Together, they were unstoppable. The final battle took place in the shadow of Concord Prime. The swarm had gathered its remaining forces for a last assault on the heart of galactic civilization. 12,000,000 ships formed a wall of death that seemed impossible to break. Admiral Chun looked at the enemy fleet and felt no fear. "All ships," he said, "this is where it ends. This is where we show the galaxy that the darkness cannot win. This is where we prove that hope is stronger than hate. Forward." The fleet charged. The battle lasted for 3 days. Ships died in numbers too large to count. Heroes were made and lost in moments. The space around Concord Prime became a graveyard of twisted metal and frozen bodies. But on the 3rd day, the swarm broke. Their ships began to flee, scattering in every direction. The survivors were hunted down and destroyed. By the time the sun rose on the 4th day, it was over. Humanity had won. The celebrations lasted for weeks. On every world in the Concord, people gathered to thank the humans and Kethri who had saved them. The old fear and suspicion was gone. In its place was something new: gratitude and shame. The surviving members of the Concord met in the Hall of 10,000 Voices to decide what would come next. The building had survived the war, though its crystal walls were cracked and its lights were dim. Only 2,000 species remained of the 4,000 who had once sat in this hall. Premiere. Tanaka was invited to speak. She stood in the same place where Elena Vasquez had stood a century before. She looked up at the faces watching her and remembered the stories she had grown up with. The trial, the verdict, the walk. 100 years ago, she said, my species stood in this hall and was told that our compassion was a crime. We were ordered to abandon those who trusted us. We were threatened with destruction if we refused. She paused. We refused anyway. The hall was silent. We did not leave the Concord because we hated you. We left because we could not be like you. We could not stand by and watch while children died. We could not call genocide justice. We could not pretend that laws were more important than lives. She raised her hand, and behind her, a Kethri delegation entered the hall. They were tall and proud, dressed in clothes that combined human and Kethri designs. Their leader was a young female named Sully, the granddaughter of the poet who had written verses about the beings from the stars. This is what we chose to protect, Tanaka said. This is what we were willing to die for. And today we stand here together, not as conquerors, but as partners. She looked at the survivors of the Concord. We are not here to punish you. We are not here to gloat. We are here to offer you a choice. You can rebuild the old Concord with its old laws and its old fears. You can pretend that the last 100 years never happened. She shook her head. Or you can build something new, something better, something that remembers why laws exist in the first place. To protect the weak, to defend the innocent, to give every species a chance to reach for the stars. She walked to Sully and took her hand. The Kethri have a seat at this table. That is not negotiable, but everything else is up to you. Choose well. She turned and began to walk toward the doors. The Arbiter General, a new crystal being who had replaced the one that had condemned humanity so long ago, called out to her. Wait, it said. What do you want from us? What must we give you in return for your help? Tanaka stopped. She thought about her grandmother, who had spent her youth teaching Kethri children to read. She thought about Elena Vasquez, who had died peacefully in her sleep, knowing that she had done the right thing. She thought about all the humans in Kethri who had given their lives in the war that had just ended. We want nothing, she said. We did not save you because we wanted payment. We saved you because it was right, because you needed help and we could give it. She smiled. That is what humanity is. That is what we have always been. We help those who need helping. We protect those who cannot protect themselves. And we never, ever abandon our friends. She looked at Sally. The Kethri taught us that our choice mattered. They remembered when we might have forgotten. And together, we will make sure that the galaxy never forgets again. They walked out of the hall together. Behind them, the surviving members of the Concord began to talk. Old arguments were forgotten. Old fears were set aside. For the first time in 9,000 years, they considered the possibility that their laws might be wrong. It took 3 years to build the new alliance. It was called the Accord, and its first law was simple. No species could be condemned to extinction by any vote. The Kethri held a founding seat. So did humanity. So did the remnant clans and the drifter collectives and dozens of other species who had watched from the edges of the galaxy and finally decided to join. On the day the Accord was signed, an old woman sat in a garden on Earth and watched the stars come out. She was the last survivor of the original 2,000 volunteers who had gone to Kethra so long ago. Her hands shook and her eyes were dim, but she smiled as she watched the news coverage of the ceremony. A young Kethri child sat beside her. He was the great-great-grandson of the farmer she had helped save, and he had come to Earth to meet her. Was it worth it? He asked. All the suffering? All the years of isolation? Was it worth it? The old woman looked at the boy. She remembered the day she had first arrived on Kethra. She remembered the fear and the hope and the desperate belief that what she was doing mattered. Yes, she said. Every moment, every sacrifice, every choice. She took his small hand in hers. We proved something important. We proved that the measure of a people is not how they treat those who can help them. It is how they treat those who need their help. We proved that principles are not just words. They are the foundation of everything we are. She looked up at the stars. Humanity walked away from the Concord because we could not stand by while innocent people died. And look what happened. Look what we built. Look what we became. She squeezed his hand. Walking away was never the end of the story, she whispered. It was just the beginning. The stars blazed above them, brighter than they had ever been before. And somewhere in the vastness of space, the new Accord began its work of building a galaxy where no one would ever have to walk alone again.